Alright, I'm gonna give this a shot. To be honest, I'm not very good with videos. I haven't recorded, I guess, a personal video like this or anything since I went to Japan right before I got married. But I'm attempting to organize here in Moscow for Black Lives Matter, for George Floyd, for Arbery, for racial disparity, and I've come across an interesting notion that's been passed my way, and that is that Moscow doesn't have racism. It doesn't exist here. I've heard the argument that maybe the idea of systemic racism exists. Maybe institutional racism might exist. But let me just share a few things. I'm a social worker. I graduated with my master's degree about 7 years ago. And so I study a lot, just because it's what I like to do. Let's start with something minor. Back in 2005, a bunch of postcards were mailed to about 500 residents in Moscow after an event was hosted. Then I would think it was about 2000, I think it was right around that time, maybe a little bit later. There was a woman, Barbara Couch. She, at the time, described Moscow as the friendliest place that she had ever been. She was the director of the Leyte Economic Development Council, and her husband was Sheriff Jeff Crouch. And she ended up writing, well, she was in a piece where she said that she was leaving town where racism had been given some like approval, tacit approval. So she quote said, "The entire town seems to say, 'Why are you upset?'" And she's a black woman. She was acknowledging that people were very upset that she was leaving Moscow because it's not a good place to raise a racial family. And, breaking off from that, I don't see that here. Let me be clear. I don't see a whole lot of racial families here. So let me continue. So Mayor Comstock at the time said that, she has the right to her opinion, and respects her as a person and as a professional, but does not agree with her assessment of Moscow. He, quote, says, "It's frustrating when we have accusations that this town is a racist town. I've had many friends who are minorities who say this is not a racist town." How many times have you heard that? I have a black friend, so I can say this. The mayor. I've recently come into my knowledge of how I don't know about a lot of things, and one of those things is white privilege. I know that it exists, on a research level, a sociological level, and racial disparity with numbers, but I'm white, I don't understand. And this is insane. So let's continue. Northern Idaho has a pretty big history with racism, right? I mean, we have the Aryan nations, we have Ruby Ridge, those who are not familiar, Ruby Ridge was sort of folks that wanted to break off. There was basically a giant gunfight. No one knows how it started. The ATF got involved, and they went and there was the arrest of Randy Weaver in '92, and he said that homeschool, and he wanted to, homeschooling was his reason for moving here from Iowa, and he wanted to escape what he and his wife saw as a corrupted world. They wanted to move here specifically because they wanted to teach their children the lessons that they felt were important. And if you read what the lessons are, they're all based around the fact that white supremacy is how things are. Mind you, the Aryan Nation was only ran out of northern Idaho, ran out of Hayden in 2000 after the Georgia Southern Poverty Law Center filed a lawsuit. As we continue, sorry about the pauses, I'm just processing what I want to say. I would encourage you to go read about the Sand Creek Byway, and the tolerance of people's views here in northern Idaho. There's a lot of silence about racism here. There's a lot of silence against tolerance here. And and then the thing is racism in Moscow is mostly tactically unnoticed on purpose. Now I'm about to get into something that publicly I have not spoken about, and I don't care anymore. I don't care if it burns bridges or relationships or anything like that for this matter. Let's talk about Doug Wilson and Christchurch. Doug Wilson is the lead, I can't even call him a pastor. He's the lead person that stands on a pulpit and sits on his throne for Christchurch. He has a religious empire that has slowly started to take over the city of Moscow and has only recently been noticed as doing so. There is a college here in Moscow called New St. Andrews, which Christchurch made, and we have a big problem. Now, I'm also going to say, as a part of this, that I am calling on anyone that claims to be a Christian, anyone that claims to love Jesus. Listen very carefully. Listen very, very carefully. In 2004, and ongoing, to be honest, Doug Wilson co-wrote a book. The book was around the idea of the defense of Southern slavery. Now here's the deal. If you go and ask anyone from Christchurch, or you go and ask anyone, they'll say, well, we're not racists. We don't believe in racial inequality, but we support Southern slavery. You can't. That idea is ridiculous. Here's a quote. Slavery as it existed in the South was based on a relationship upon mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. That man he's got a church over there. Moscow. He lives here. He has a college here. But racism doesn't exist in Moscow. What I found is that the people of Moscow that I've interacted with around this issue that aren't, on board with the idea that Black Lives Matter is that they don't care. They turn a blind eye to it. And complacency will be the death of justice in this town. He continues. Slave life was to them, to the slaves, a life of plenty, of simple pleasures, of food, clothes, and good medical care. Maybe not the most accurate film, but go watch Django Unchained, Quentin Tarantino film. If you're a child, don't go watch it. Go watch 12 Years as a Slave. I was actually recommended another movie, and I'm not quite positive what the name of it is. There's a documentary on Netflix called The 13th. It's about the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery that talks about the mass incarceration after the abolitionist movement. Doug Wilson was developing this theology that married an enthusiastic endorsement for the antebellum South with religious government, and is now the center of the neo-Confederacy movement that still exists. In the 90s, he started talking at these Confederate heritage conferences in Monroe, and then he became a regular speaker. But that's old, Rob. That's old news. He doesn't believe in that anymore. Okay. Here's a more recent quote as of 2019. Regarding interracial relationships and interracial marriages. Wise parents will weigh any union involving extremely diverse cultural backgrounds. Wilson says that slavery is not a sin, and if the owner treats his slaves humanely, then comes a rite of passage. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the world. Moscow doesn't have a problem. It has a disease. What's happened in Minneapolis, what's happened in Georgia, what's happened in Michigan, what's happened all over this country, what's happened to Black Americans, is not a stranger to Moscow. It's just subtle. And it's the demon that sleeps under your bed. It's the evil that creeps up at you at night, and it's infecting this town. So I urge you, I have a Facebook page. You can just search for Rob Tarver. I have an event. We're trying to organize a protest. I'm not quite sure when it's going to be. There is a date set on it, but I'm not 100% on that date. You can go to bit.ly/protestmoscow2020 to get there. And spread the word. This is disgusting. And the fact that this isn't talked about, the fact that they live right over there and are not held accountable, that's one of my problems, amongst the many. Black Lives Matter. To those that have died, been murdered at the hands of horrible human beings, say their name. Educate yourself. Try to learn about your privilege. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. Tension's a healthy thing. If you're a Christian and you're sitting in your house thinking this isn't your problem, you're delusional. If you're thinking, I can't protest, Christ stood for justice. What will people think of me is something that I've heard. If you're worried about your reputation, you need to take a whole long, hard look in the mirror. I know this is coming off as very aggressive, but I needed to get it off my chest. Love each other. I don't know how to end a video.